The restaurant buzzed with life, its opulent chandeliers casting a golden glow over the polished floors. Waiters glided between tables, carrying trays laden with gourmet dishes, their movements brisk and precise. At one corner of the room, a group of diners laughed loudly, their designer clothes and sparkling jewelry glinting under the lights. It was the kind of place where wealth and status weren't just expected, they were required. Amidst the chatter and clinking glasses, the door opened, and a man stepped inside. He was older, his frame slightly stooped, and his clothes were simple, almost too plain for a place like this. His brown blazer and scuffed shoes didn't match the sharp suits and designer dresses around him. He paused for a moment, scanning the room before making his way to the host stand. The hostess, a young woman with a sharp smile, glanced up at him and hesitated. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, and she quickly turned to the head waiter, gesturing subtly for him to come over. The head waiter, a tall man with a sharp jawline and a demeanor that matched the restaurant's exclusivity, approached the man with a calculated smile. "Good evening, sir," the waiter said, his tone polite but slightly clipped. "Do you have a reservation?" The man returned his smile, his voice calm and steady. "No, I don't. But I was hoping you might have a table available." The waiter's smile faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," he said smoothly, glancing at the empty tables scattered throughout the dining room. "Perhaps you could try another time." The older man didn't seem bothered by the response. He nodded, his eyes scanning the room again, taking in the lavish setting. "I see," he said quietly. "That's all right. Thank you." But just as he turned to leave, another voice cut through the air. A younger waiter who had been standing nearby, his expression less polished and far more candid. "I don't think this is the kind of place for someone like you," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "You might want to try somewhere else." The words hung in the air, drawing the attention of nearby diners. A few turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disdain. The older man paused, his hand resting on the door handle, and glanced back at the young waiter. His face remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something unspoken, yet powerful. "You're probably right," the man said, his tone quiet but firm. "This might not be the place for me." Without another word, he opened the door and stepped out, the sound of the bustling street outside briefly filling the restaurant before the door closed behind him. The young waiter smirked, glancing at his colleagues, who exchanged uneasy looks. The head waiter frowned, his earlier confidence replaced with a vague sense of discomfort. None of them realized that the man they had just dismissed was far more than he appeared. As the door closed behind the man, the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, though a subtle tension lingered in the air. The younger waiter, feeling emboldened by his words, chuckled quietly to himself. "Can you believe he thought he could just walk in here?" he said, shaking his head as he wiped down an already spotless table. The head waiter shot him a sharp glance. "That's enough," he said curtly, though the authority in his voice was tempered by his own discomfort. "Get back to work." Around the room, a few diners exchanged murmurs. They hadn't missed the exchange, and while some seemed amused, others appeared uneasy. A couple near the window whispered to each other, their expressions tinged with disapproval. "That man looked familiar," the woman said, glancing toward the door. "I can't quite place him, but I'm sure I've seen him before." Her husband shrugged, dismissing the thought. "Probably some nobody," he said lightly. "This isn't exactly the place for the uninvited." Meanwhile, in the back of the restaurant, the kitchen staff continued their work, oblivious to the incident. Orders were shouted, plates were arranged with precision, and the smell of gourmet meals filled the air. But for the waitstaff in the front, the moment lingered like a shadow, unsettling but unspoken. About 20 minutes later, the restaurant's manager arrived. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he walked in with the air of someone who commanded respect. He had been called in for an unexpected meeting, though the details had been vague. As he approached the host's stand, he noticed the head waiter's uneasy expression. "What's going on?" the manager asked, his tone brisk. The head waiter hesitated, then quickly straightened his posture. "Nothing, sir," he replied. "Just a busy evening." Before the manager could press further, the restaurant's main phone rang, its sharp tone cutting through the hum of conversation. The hostess answered quickly, her cheerful demeanor fading as she listened to the person on the other end. Her eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at the manager. "Sir," she said, covering the receiver with her hand. "There's a call for you. They say it's urgent." The manager frowned but took the phone, his voice polite but firm. "This is the manager. How can I help you?" A moment passed, and then his expression changed. The color drained from his face, and his grip on the phone tightened. "Wait, could you repeat that?" he said, his voice quieter now. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, though his face betrayed a growing sense of alarm. When he hung up, he turned to the staff, his expression stern. "Where is the waiter who was at the door earlier?" he demanded. The head waiter stepped forward hesitantly. "That would be John," he said, nodding toward the younger waiter, who was busy stacking menus at the bar. "Get him," the manager ordered. "Now." The head waiter hurried over to John, who looked up, puzzled. "What's going on?" John asked, his tone still laced with arrogance. "The manager wants to see you," the head waiter replied, his voice tense. As John walked over, the manager fixed him with a piercing stare. "Did you speak to an older gentleman who came in earlier?" the manager asked, his tone icy. John blinked, confused by the intensity of the question. "Yeah," he said casually. "He didn't have a reservation, so I told him we were full." "Why?" The manager's jaw tightened. "And did you say anything else?" he pressed. John shrugged, still oblivious. "I might have mentioned this wasn't the place for him. I mean, look at the kind of people who come here. He didn't exactly fit in." The manager's glare could have frozen fire. "That man," he said slowly, enunciating every word, "is Warren Buffett. He owns this restaurant." The room fell silent. John's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure disbelief. "What?" he stammered. "That can't be." "It is," the manager snapped, "and he just called to inform me of what happened." He was polite, of course, but the disappointment in his voice was clear. John's face turned pale, and his mouth opened and closed as he struggled to respond. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "I didn't mean—" "That's the problem," the manager interrupted sharply. "You judged him based on how he looked, and now you've embarrassed this entire restaurant." The rest of the staff watched in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy fog. The diners who had overheard the exchange earlier now looked on with a mix of shock and intrigue. No one spoke, the gravity of the moment rendering them speechless. The manager took a deep breath, his frustration evident. "Warren Buffett doesn't care about appearances," he said, his tone quieter, but still firm. "What he cares about is respect, and tonight, we failed to show it." As the words sank in, the door to the restaurant opened once again. This time, the staff and diners turned their heads in unison, their eyes widening as Warren Buffett stepped back inside. Warren Buffett stepped into the restaurant, his demeanor calm and collected, as if the earlier incident hadn't fazed him at all. The staff froze in place, their eyes darting between him and the manager. The diners, too, turned their attention to the man who had just re-entered the room, their whispers growing louder as the realization of who he was spread like wildfire. The manager hurried forward, his polished demeanor replaced with a mixture of panic and regret. "Mr. Buffett," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "I cannot begin to express how sorry we are for the way you were treated earlier. Please, allow me to personally—" Warren raised a hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. "There's no need for apologies," he said, his tone steady. "I'm not here for a grand gesture." The calm in his voice contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. He glanced around, his eyes landing briefly on the younger waiter, John, who stood frozen near the bar, his face pale and his hands trembling. Warren turned back to the manager. "I'd like to sit at a table now," he said simply, "if that's all right." Of course," the manager stammered, gesturing toward the best table in the house. "Please, right this way." As Warren was seated, the manager leaned toward the hostess. "Make sure the service is flawless," he whispered urgently. "We can't afford another mistake." John, who was still standing stiffly near the bar, felt his stomach churn. The earlier confidence he had exuded was now completely gone. He watched as Warren settled into his seat, seemingly unbothered by the commotion around him. The contrast between the old man's calm and John's growing dread was almost unbearable. Minutes later, the head waiter brought over a menu and nervously handed it to Warren. "Please, take your time, sir," he said, his voice shaky. "Anything you'd like is on the house." Warren smiled faintly, opening the menu and scanning it for a moment before setting it down. "Thank you," he said, "but I think I'll start with a glass of water." The waiter nodded quickly and hurried off to fulfill the request. Meanwhile, John's anxiety grew with every passing second. He couldn't bring himself to move, let alone meet Warren's gaze. The other staff avoided looking at him, silently grateful not to be in his position. After a few minutes, Warren motioned for the manager to come over. "Would you mind if I had a word with the young man who greeted me earlier?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The manager hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Of course, Mr. Buffett," he said quickly, turning to gesture for John to step forward. John's heart pounded as he approached the table, his legs feeling like they might give out beneath him. He stopped a few feet away, unable to meet Warren's gaze. "Please have a seat," Warren said, motioning to the chair across from him. John hesitated, then slowly sat down. He finally looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm so sorry for what I said earlier," he stammered. "I didn't know who you were." Warren tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "But that's the point, isn't it?" he said quietly. "You didn't know who I was, so you assumed I wasn't worth your respect." John swallowed hard, his shame deepening. "I didn't mean to," he began, but Warren held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not here to humiliate you," Warren said calmly. "I've been in this world long enough to know that people make mistakes. What matters is what you learn from them." John nodded quickly, his eyes darting down to the table. "I understand," he said. "I'll do better. I promise." Warren leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. "Good," he said simply, "because the world is full of people who judge others based on appearances. It's up to people like you, those who interact with others every day, to break that cycle." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. John nodded again, his face etched with determination. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll remember this." Warren smiled faintly, then turned his attention back to the menu. "That's all I needed to hear," he said, signaling that the conversation was over. John stood and walked back to the bar, feeling both humbled and relieved. The rest of the staff watched him closely, their expressions a mix of sympathy and respect. The manager exhaled slowly, grateful that the situation hadn't escalated further. As the evening went on, the restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, though the atmosphere remained charged with the weight of what had happened. Warren finished his meal quietly, leaving a generous tip on the table before standing to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back to address the room. "Thank you all for your service tonight," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "And remember, how you treat others matters more than anything else." With that, he stepped out into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who would never forget the lesson he had imparted. As Warren Buffett stepped outside into the cool night air, the restaurant behind him felt utterly transformed. The weight of his presence, his words, and the lesson he delivered hung heavily in the air, leaving everyone, staff and diners alike, in deep reflection. Inside, the manager stood near the host stand, his face a mixture of relief and shame. He turned to address the staff, his tone somber but resolute. "What happened tonight should never have occurred," he said. "From now on, we treat every single person who walks through those doors with the respect they deserve, no matter what they look like." The staff nodded quietly, their earlier chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. John, the young waiter, lingered near the bar, still processing the events of the night. His arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by a raw sense of humility. For the first time, he realized how much his actions, his words, could impact someone else, even someone like Warren Buffett. As the diners finished their meals and began to leave, the story of the evening spread among them, each retelling infused with awe and admiration. They weren't just dining at a restaurant anymore. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a rare moment where someone with true power used it not to punish, but to teach. Meanwhile, Warren walked down the sidewalk, blending seamlessly into the city's rhythm. He didn't need accolades or recognition for what he had done. His satisfaction came from knowing that his quiet intervention might ripple outward, inspiring not just one waiter, but an entire room of people to see the world a little differently.